You're listening to Extratextual, the show where we tell stories about movies while the movies tell our stories. Each episode will bring you a special guest who shares a personal story connected to a meaningful film in their life. Then we share some kind of connected story from our own film experiences. And as always, we learn something new about ourselves and others. Welcome to Extratextual. This is going to be sort of a special episode for us. We've talked a lot about one of our loves on this show, and that is Star Wars. So it's just Jeremy and I this week, and we are just talking about some of the stuff happening in Star Wars recently. Are you excited for this, Jeremy?
I am. I just drank a tall glass of water out of my unique commemorative Sith and good guys tumblers that I got from the Alamo Draft House when I was in there watching Rise of Skywalker this January.
Oh, nice. It's got both sides?
Hold on, I'll show you.
Okay. You know this is audio.
Yeah, I know, but it's not.
Oh, it's two tumblers. I thought it was one tumbler that had both sides.
There you go.
That's very nice.
They're pretty high quality.
There's some nice illustration on here from the movie. So I sort of want to start us out by telling you a little bit about my youth, Jeremy.
About your youth, Eli?
My youth. And I think I've said on the show before.
Back in Iowa.
That I've always had Star Wars in my consciousness, right?
Yeah.
It's always been there. Like, I don't remember a time that I didn't know Star Wars, and I think you've maybe expressed something similar.
Yeah.
I mean, we were about right at the age where they were coming on TV and VHS, and we had them available, right?
Yeah.
Even though we may not have been in the theater for those originals.
My experience of it was in my own home.
Yeah.
We had all of them on one long-playing VHS.
Yeah. So I always knew it, but fans of Star Wars talk about sort of like this dark period of time where we didn't think there was ever going to be any more Star Wars, right? George Lucas seemed to be done.
Maybe we were playing like the Star Wars role-playing game and like the Star Wars video games, but
that's all we had, essentially. And so I think in my, say, junior high years, I had sort of dropped off those last few years of kind of like watching the movies a lot and stuff, because there wasn't anything to kind of keep it fresh in my mind, right? As I was growing older. And so growing up in a small town in Iowa, as you mentioned, we had two places to rent videos on VHS. It was either the gas station, Come and Go, everybody knows that. Great name. And the local pizza place, who had a couple walls of videos that you could rent besides, getting your local pizza there. So Mark's Pizza, if you needed to know. So
I did.
Good pizza. So I would go to the pizza shop and would get to rent videos sometimes myself. And so I found the original Star Wars films there. We didn't have copies personally. And so I was like, I need to refresh my memory of these. And so it was this cool experience of me just kind of going back and remembering. And like, the images and ideas really had stuck with me, but rediscovering like the details of it really clearly. And I think going into high school, I became much more kind of knowledgeable on it because I just kind of dived into it a lot more. And by adulthood, I knew every bit and part of those original trilogies. So then, going into high school, we, as you said, there did start to be a little more materials. I think Dark Horse picked up the rights to the comics, and so there was a little more going on there. More novels, games that you could play, card games even, and things. So, and then we started to get news of the prequels, right?
And leading up to the release of the prequels, there was the Golden Age, more the Silver Age, when they re-released them in the theaters.
Right.
And it just seemed like, at that time I went to a private school, and I only got off like every third or fourth weekend. But like every new weekend I had off, I could go with my older brother to see the new Star Wars movie.
Special edition?
Yeah. And it was just great. I mean, I wish they should do it. They should do like every 5 years or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's the whole debate over the updates to it, the effects and stuff. But I think it was going back to when I first re-rented them from that video store, and this cool experience in life of sort of rediscovering a world that was so fascinating to get into, and maybe having a little bit older sense of the emotions in it too. Not just like the playfulness of it. So I think they're thinking about the latest film, The Rise of Skywalker, and we're going to talk about The Mandalorian today too, because they both kind of came out right around the same time. Mandalorian started a little bit earlier before the movie came out, so it's easy to kind of contrast them. But I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around The Rise of Skywalker, where I feel like it's both masterfully made technically, sort of, and it feels sort of good watching it, but it sort of like loses some of its luster to think back on it, and there's a lot of things that I could have gripes with and nits to pick, and I don't. It's both like a weird feeling of I don't feel unsatisfied or unresolved. Not that I felt that there was a lot to be like resolved as a 9-film series, but at the same time sort of not even feeling like let down, but maybe that is this really the story that we should have gotten? Does that make sense? Like, I'm not dissatisfied with that film necessarily in a lot of ways, but I don't think as a complete story, and we can talk more about this, it definitely was not thought out, right? And everybody, most general knowledge is the prequels are not as good. So I kind of just leave that where that is. But it was a complete story, at least. Yeah. So I'm kind of wondering where you're at going into the 9th and final Skywalker film.
The 9th and final Skywalker film.
Yeah.
So, well, first of all, I mean, I don't even see them as like the Skywalker set of 9 movies. I mean, even
I don't know that it had to be that. No.
And
this film sort of made it that.
Yeah. And it just, I mean, the first time I watched the film, watched it in Flicks Brew House here in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a great place to watch films. I was like pretty like unabashedly disappointed with the movie. And it took me a lot. I mean, and I am, for those regular listeners of the show, I mean, I am generally not a picky or gripey fanboy about stuff, or at least I try not to be. Yeah. But I do generally have strong opinions about stuff. And we'll talk more about the details, but watching the movie, it came down to me thinking like Rian Johnson seemed to really like treat the Star Wars story with respect and some level of reverence, because regardless of and I say reverence not because it's like something a bunch of people are like really into and it has lots of a following, and I just mean like the kinds of things that people said in it, the kinds of larger issues that were talked about. I mean, like, I mean, some of for me, like my first foray into philosophy was through Star Wars, through things Yoda says, through things Ben says, and it's like, and if I to this day, if I'm going to be told like a truth about the universe, I'm sitting on a log and it's Ben Kenobi. Like that's how like I envision like the universe telling me about how stuff works. So the other part, like by the end of the film, when like Rey defeats the Emperor and what just seems like a ridiculous nonsense gobbledygook ending, and then the kiss, I mean, I just felt like it was in some sense like unfair to be critical of the movie on a lot of levels, because it wasn't trying to be the thing that I wanted it to be. Like,
yeah, I mean, maybe that's getting at it. I mean, I kind of feel like the same. Almost like I can't, for some reason, the way the film is made or presented, I feel like it's almost like I can't be too critical of it. Almost like it is a fun adventure in the Star Wars world. It's well made, lavishly made, and I had a good time. Can I really knock points off for that?
I mean,
as a Star Wars film?
It gets one of those things that it's somewhat in the category of us, when we griped about, us intellectual gamers, griping about people that play Call of Duty taking over the entire game economy.
Yeah.
What about us that were playing Ravenloft and and Commander Keen back in the day. In some sense, it pains me to say this, but it just felt dumb. I mean, it was like someone, a child making a Star Wars movie. There's supposed to be space battle. Oh wait, there's supposed to be tension. Oh wait, there's supposed to be an old guy with lightning.
Yeah.
And it fell flat. I mean, some of the best parts about it, I think, are you can see that they had some sense of what this could have been. Mm-hmm. There's so much that gets crammed.
Yeah.
In there that there's no room for, I think, creativity and genius in it. Mm-hmm. I mean, a friend of mine who obsesses about Star Wars, who's not you, was listening to whatever.
Yeah.
When Kylo Ren jumps on that thing and says "ouch" at the end, that is a highlight for me. For some reason, that captures some of what, and also the
feel of Star Wars.
Well. Something that carries the import of what's happening. When he smiles, that is interesting to me.
Yeah.
And that is powerful in his story. Mm-hmm. And I initially hated about 98% of the ending. The second time I watched it, though, I did see what I thought they might have been going for, which I liked more. I only hated 80%. And that was because Rey says something like, "I'm going to beat you, Emperor," or whatever. Yeah. And the Emperor says, but when I was last defeated, when Luke beat me, whatever, his father saved him. Mm-hmm. And there's no one here to save
no family.
you, Rey.
Yeah. I'm your family. Yeah.
Because part of what I seemed like Rian Johnson was going for in the second film was that this is just Rey. Mm-hmm. She's not Rey Skywalker. Right. She's not Rey of the great lineage of dragon slayers, or she's just Rey.
Right.
And my friends and I talk about it, and we Rey from nowhere, right? Mm-hmm. And so that story is cool, and I like that. And one of the best reviews that I read about the contrast between 8 and 9 talked about the iconoclastic elements of Episode 8. They're breaking down heroes. They're breaking down the good guys because of that stuff with DJ. They're just they're breaking down Luke, the great masterful Jedi. And I think that, and like I said when we talked about Episode 8, you got to have both.
Yeah.
You got to have this vision of Luke doing his Jedi Academy and this sort of crusty old Luke who's on the cusp of learning the deep lessons that he's been trying to learn his whole life.
I know Rian Johnson has said that he really tried to think of, and he does this in a lot of his films, what would be the hardest thing for this character to go through, or make their mission the hardest would be Rey is not special. Her family's not special.
Right.
Luke loses his faith in being a Jedi. Those things would be the hardest things for them to deal with, right? Yeah. Which is that makes them interesting characters.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so, there's also you talk, and so those are some of my favorite parts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it raises, for me in my mind, the new film, how good The Last Jedi is. It made it even better. I mean, and I think
that becomes a generational gem. Yeah, we're not going to get that for another go round.
And I was thinking so much, I'm not so strict about, I'm not one of those people that have been George Lucas should have finished his series or whatever. I'm not, because obviously the prequels were not great. It's not the same vision exactly of the original. But I do feel like they definitely did not have a plan for these 3 films, a through line. And you can see it and feel it. Yeah. And it did need, and again, I'm not so much we need an auteur to have oversaw these, But there needed to be a vision if they're going to tell those 3 films as a story, right? As a continuation of that. And it didn't feel like that. But I think Rian Johnson did a good job of, like you said, he's doing new things, but he's also staying in what makes Star Wars great in that world. I think he runs that line. Because I also don't want to see some people are like, well, Star Wars should do new things. We should see, them advance it. And I think there's room for that outside of this trilogy too. We've seen some other interesting films, Rogue One and the Solo movie. And you can do that, but I think we can also still give it that original Star Wars feel and also push these characters into new places and have surprises. I think The Last Jedi was the last time I've been surprised seeing a Star Wars film in the theater, including the prequels and all that. That personally I've seen. That gives me that sort of same surprise of Darth Vader being Luke's father or Leia being the sister of Luke. We had those sort of big surprises in that film.
Yeah.
Watching it,
and I think too. I mean, and I've seen The Last Jedi many times, and there's just this unmistakable gestalt. It's a good name, right?
For the film,
yes.
Rise of Skywalker is horrible.
The Last Jedi is
horrible.
I mean, it's like it's so good that you could confuse it with one of the original 3, right? I know that. So one of the things that differs between you and I is that I do not call Episode 3 A New Hope. I call it Star Wars.
Yeah, I mostly do too. Yeah,
which is totally fine. And I didn't really, it makes sense.
Yeah,
right. So you have The Last Jedi, which I think has a great title, and it has and the hallmarks of a good title for me are your perception of its meaning changes across the film, and it does, right? Because you think it's kind of Rey, and then it's Luke, and then it's Rey again, and then maybe it's Leia, or all this sorts of stuff. There's all kinds of. It's like an active conversation partner throughout the entire film, and my experience of it, having watched it many times, is I can see now. The first time I watched it, it's not perfect, but once they get to Crate, it becomes so terribly captivating. Because everything that happens, I do not know what's going to happen next. And I thought those ski things were a bit clunky, and I wish George Lucas knows how to design a goddamn ship. Okay,
yeah.
But the general vision of them on that red planet with the white salt charging out into the blazing sun with the walkers, fantastic, just absolutely visionary. And then to have Luke allow the good guys to escape by like Kylo Ren's like childish anger in a shadow boxing match.
Right.
I mean, just fantastic.
Yeah.
And even watching it, probably like the fifth time or something, that battle is great.
Yeah.
Like that is like top 3, samurai Jedi showdowns.
And I think I recently sent you this comparison that came out of Rey's training and her lightsaber moves almost exactly patterning Kylo Ren's, which again is just like amazing to have that forethought of people just now sort of realizing this sort of shadow and this connection between them even to that degree, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
And I mean, I know maybe 15 years ago we would have been like ragging on George Lucas about stuff, but I mean, there are a few sort of fan stories. Like, I don't know if you've talked about the ring theory in connection to the prequels. Like, so I mean, when you look at like the shot by shot comparison of the beginning and the end, it's symmetrical,
right?
And and I don't know what that means, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it has better storytelling, but it does have a completeness and a forethought that can only be expressed in that kind of way. I think
that connection.
I mean, the part that I wanted to say also about The Last Jedi is it I think does balance something which is 100% Star Wars with something that is a little bit interesting and new. And it does that in a way that, I mean, I just am not sympathetic in general to the like main complaints. Like Leia comes back from the dead, they get a Canto bite, yada yada, all these things. I like all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think Canto Bite's trying to say some interesting new things about that world, which, you know, of course get dropped in the Rise of the Skywalker. But yeah, I mean, overall, maybe that section is not completely successful, but what it's trying to say, I love seeing rooms full of aliens. I'm a sucker for that, so I'll go for that. And that was his chance to do that, so I don't begrudge him that. Yeah.
And so when we get to, I guess there's just there's like a bucket and it has dumb written on it, and there's just so many things from Rise of Skywalker that go in there.
Yeah,
like the dagger.
Yeah, the dagger is bad. It doesn't seem Star Wars and doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and like there's this. I mean, one of the things. So Kylo Ren has a great line when he lands and he says, "Ouch," right? That's great. He also says like this line to Rey, which like I can imagine. So this is the line. He's like, "Your parents were nothing because they chose to be nothing," and like this is like the linchpin of how like The Last Jedi fits in with The Rise of Skywalker, and it's like I imagine those motherfuckers sitting around a table trying to figure out how to make that work and coming up with this, and it's moments like that where I can clearly see like like J.J. Abrams and a few script writers in a room that I am no longer part of this story.
Yeah.
Like that is not, Kylo Ren is not saying that because Kylo Ren says that. He's not saying that because Rey needs to hear it. He's not saying that for any other reason other than something completely outside of the story as it relates to Kylo and Rey. It's just for the franchise.
Right.
And I mean, I just it's not so much the unbelievability of the Emperor, which I'm like fine, like Palpatine's bad, like go fight the big bad, like good on you. I think like the giant room filled with Sith or whatever, that's
followers
in the dumb box, like. And like also in the dumb box, I don't know what J.J. Abrams' obsession with this is, but like. Every like he's like Oprah with the deaths, like the Star Destroyers, and you get a planet killing gun, and you get a planet killing gun, and you get a planet killing gun. But
every time that's gonna work, right?
Right.
One of these times it's gonna work.
But you like have to, and you're like, well, and here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna put it on a little planet where there's only like a tiny little hole that they can fly through. Yeah. Like, oh man, it's so bad, and it's like it. And I think maybe it's also one of those things where what I always call the Green Lantern problem, like he had near infinite budget, could do pretty much whatever he wanted. And I do like the Sith. I mean, I like
that concept.
Like I love the world of the Knights of the Old Republic. I really like that conflict as it plays out in Clone Wars and in Rebels. There's a lot of really interesting things there. But this is no offense to my 7-year-old child, who I love dearly, but like those are the kind of Star Destroyers he would design.
Right.
He's like, what do you do? I put the Death Star gun on its butt. You know? Come on. I mean,
it definitely felt like there were things like they decided Rey would get Leia's lightsaber. They were like, it'd be cool to have Leia have a lightsaber and get that.
Yeah.
But then they like work themselves into corners and be like, well, now we got to explain how Leia trained as a Jedi to be, trained with her lightsaber to be a Jedi. And so now, we have to show that somehow. So now we have to figure out how to have this scene where they have to wear these blast helmets. So we don't see their face all the time because we can't really use her, but we see it for a moment and we have to like throw this in and we never knew that before. So it's like all these, and the film like felt like a lot of that. Like we had this concept and now we got to like work backwards to fit it in, or we have to answer this fan question because they're going to say, well, what about Rey's parents? You said this before. Oh, we got to like address that. Right. Yeah.
It just, I mean, I agree with you 100%, except 98%.
Yeah.
I actually liked seeing young Luke and young Leia training in the Forest. I
Yeah.
know it was CGI, and I know I complain about that a lot.
Yeah.
But to have a moment where Leia's training as a Jedi, that's worth it to me.
Yeah.
However,
I didn't dislike that. I just think
well,
it was sort of shoehorned in.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
no.
Yeah,
and then,
yeah.
like, there's a line at the end of that sequence where she's like, and he says, and then she saw that her son at the end of her trip. Like,
Yeah.
this is terrible. Like, I mean, and I guess, like, one of the things that I this is just how I feel about it. Like, for everything George Lucas did in the prequels, he did not, in my opinion, make it stupid. Like, I may not have loved that pod race, but you and I were with Tyler, and Tyler loved that pod race,
Yeah.
and some of our younger Star Wars
Right.
lovers love that.
Cool. Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
I want to give me, like,
Yeah.
I need shit that's built out of, like, battleship kits flying in space. Like, I need, George Lucas style
design.
shooting. I don't need, this new CGI running through a canyon stuff. But it wasn't stupid.
Yeah.
And The Force Awakens, not stupid. Last Jedi, not stupid. Rise of Skywalker, a whole lot of stupid.
Yeah.
And just what I mean by stupid is, like, these things that if you're making, like, no offense, Mr. Stallone, like a Rambo movie, and like Rambo First Blood Part 2 is a nearly perfect film, so I don't have, from beginning to end, structurally and tonally,
Don't
I love
dislike
it.
all those, yeah.
No, I love those.
Yeah.
But, like, there's just so many hallmarks and of, like, cheesy slap together cinema that it has no place in Star Wars. And that, like, regardless of, like, whether it's the Emperor or Snoke or fucking some we haven't seen yet, like, that is what bothers me most about it. And it's the same thing that it's like, it's not worth my criticism because it's not like it's not Star Wars.
Yeah.
I mean, it is,
Yeah.
but it is so much like, I mean, it misses so much of what sets Star Wars apart from other films. I mean, it's not Beastmaster, like it's
Yeah.
not,
Right.
Conan, which are great films, and it's not, like Buckaroo Banzai or any of these other, and it's not Star Trek, like, and it just seemed to lose some of its storytelling intelligence, and it seems to come structurally from having to come after Episode 8. And
Yeah,
but
I mean,
the one moment that I just want to linger on for just a second is when Kylo goads Rey into, like, using her Palpatine powers to destroy the transport and kill Chewie. At that moment, I was like, "Oh shit." This movie just started.
Yeah.
Like,
Just got
like
interesting, yeah.
now you have me. And to find out that was just a clever reversal was just so disheartening.
Yeah.
And people are like, "Oh, you can't kill Chewie." I'm like, "Yeah, you can with a
Yeah.
giant sack of nuts. You can."
I mean,
like
he's-
that's artistic courage, like that I respect.
Yeah, I mean, they could have been like, he's not going to be in any more of these movies, right? If we are done with these characters.
If he's dead,
then,
he's
like,
in
then
Solo.
he's
His
dead.
best performances in that movie.
Yeah.
I mean, we can.
Let
There's
it
like
go.
he's like 200 years old, right?
Right.
We have like
Yeah.
the young Wookiee tales. I mean, there's plenty of him we can have in movies.
Yeah.
And
that
like
would have
what
been
a
interesting character.
what a tragedy to kill one of the most beloved characters. I mean, like, it would tear Rey apart. And it's like, of all the things that could possibly drive Rey to the dark side, that was about the only thing that made sense to me.
Yeah.
Because she's certainly not going to do it any other way,
Right.
other than, like, racked by her own inability, or, like, the fact that, like, she, in discovering her own power, killed one of her closest friends.
Right. Yeah. And before we get too far, I do want to mention a few things I do like.
Yeah.
And I do think some of these characters that J.J. Abrams created are really interesting.
Absolutely.
And Daisy Ridley's acting in this, I think she carried the film. Like, emotionally, she's all there, totally driving it. I think Kylo Ren, Adam Driver's pretty great too. I think he's really interesting. Maybe he could have even gotten more in this film to do. But I think her emotional journey in the last film is what kind of, like, kept my attention and drove me through it. I think, like, Poe and Finn are good characters. Poe never really got to do much at all in this series.
He's
just kind of
Finn
around.
are just like comedic, like comic relief.
Right, yeah. And so
I gotta be next
fine.
to Rey. Don't.
Yeah.
No, I'm gonna like break the Falcon. Don't. No. Chewie.
Yeah, and so they could have done much more with them. So I do like some of those performances, I think, carry it through. And part of my problem, I think, is then, maybe let J.J. Abrams tell those new characters' story and not be so beholden to the original characters. I mean, yes, I want to see Luke again. I wanted to see that in this series and some of those old characters. But then let him tell this new story. And I think people kind of go to the extreme of maybe these new films are just fan films, right? They're like fan fiction of what somebody who grew up with Star Wars as a kid now gets to make the films with a big budget, and they're like fan fiction. And I think what sets that apart is, again, The Last Jedi, which is somebody doing something interesting. And I was trying to think through, like, what's the difference? What in, like, the feel? And I think part of it is the approach of, and J.J. Abrams has done this before with, like, Star Trek, but he can really fit into that mold. He can tell a really slick story and make it look great, and it flows pretty nicely, goes down smooth, and he can pull that off. But however big of a Star Wars fan he is it something that he cares about, like, I need to tell this story? It wasn't that he needed to tell this story, right? It was that he was hired, he's very capable of making a good Star Wars film. And I think Rian Johnson approached it and said, I'm going to tell a good story within this world, right? No matter where that takes me, no matter where that takes these characters. And so at least if I have anything to look forward to, it's that they let people who have an actual good story idea create some films or trilogies that could be really fascinating within the Star Wars world. And so I hope they let that happen. There was talk of Rian Johnson having his own trilogy. They seem to kind of be waffling on that. But this may lead us to The Mandalorian, which feels like a little bit more of a loving original story told within in Star Wars.
I mean, and that I think is an understatement. I mean, The Mandalorian is like it feels... I can tell that my kids are having the experience that I had with Star Wars with The Mandalorian. I mean, my youngest draws Baby Yoda and Mandalorian on every piece of paper that he could possibly do. And in my view of it, like, there's just a couple things that happen in there that, they get me real excited. And I really enjoy it. One, it's a small cast of characters.
Right.
It's not... And I think, like, J.J. Abrams would say, like, oh, but there's all this stuff we have to do. And I'm like... No, there's not.
Right. You can tell a
like,
simple story.
How many flippin' new characters do we introduce in this story that are irrelevant? Right? Like, and it doesn't have to be Lando. It doesn't have to be, tell me a story with like 4 to 6 people. Because I mean, you look at that original, even in the original movies, like there's all these other characters are interesting.
Right.
But we need to follow a few of.
And I know J.J. Abrams didn't create the character of Rose and he got the story back, but then don't sideline her for these new characters that we have to create a new attachment to, Like, at least use her in the story for something.
And one of the things one of my friends talked about, too, this is getting stormtroopers. Okay, so Finn is a stormtrooper, right? And he encounters other people who used to be stormtroopers, and yet this does not change anyone's compunction with just killing stormtroopers.
No,
like it literally, like, we notice it as the audience, and the film does not apparently notice that fact.
Yeah,
like,
and there's a very like lovingly shot, like, one take of like stormtroopers dropping like flies as they like run down a hallway and blast them down, right? Just like treating them like nothing, right?
Right. Yeah. And so if you just contrast with like one of the highest points of comedy in all of Star Wars, which is in the final episode of The Mandalorian, you have these two scout walkers, these two scout troopers talking to each other through their radios about Baby Yoda, and one of them punches the Baby Yoda. I know it's not the Baby Yoda, I know it's the child, I'm not picky about that, but it's true. Like, that blew everyone's mind in this household, and justifiably so.
I
mean, like that. I mean, there's like so many things that are good about that. One, it lets us inside something we don't see. Two, they're using their radios, which is inherently entertaining. Two, it's similar to like droid banter in Clone Wars, where they're comic relief. It also shows that like in this particular context of the story, that they're not really invested in the Empire. They're just like waiting to get their paycheck for their dusty old armor.
Yep.
I mean, it is fantastic.
And it plays into the story eventually.
Yeah.
Like it ties it in. It's not just like a comedic moment.
And the thing is, like, so, like, so J.J. Abrams creates these characters, Poe, Kylo, Rey, all these great people, and doesn't seem to know what to do with them towards the end. Like and I don't know what the structure of like Disney Star Wars looks like. I mean, I know that Kathleen Kennedy is like the head of most of it,
right? But
like, the like Dave Filoni, Christopher Yost crew that is now in charge of the Mandalorian, like they honed their skills. They have more hours of Star Wars under their belt than anybody else,
right?
And it really shows in the Mandalorian. I mean, Queel is an amazing character. Like is it IG-88? No, it's
IG-80. I don't know,
because no, 80 is that IG unit. Is like easily like top two
really
droids. Possibly. I mean, he for the first couple episodes, he was my favorite character in all the Mandalorian. Sure, Dave Filoni has his like Seven Samurai one-off, which is fine,
right?
But part of what happens, even if you look at just the discussion of like the E-Web blaster in the last episode, is like we are taking a step back from everything, and he's explaining every little bit, and he's allowing people to like re-enter the whole world of Star Wars from a different angle. We don't really know who the Jedi are.
Yeah,
like, we don't know how powerful the Empire is. It's all gone. Yeah, right, and like that kind of. I mean, like, they don't attention to the knowledge of our people seems so, it's engaging for me. It seems so intelligent. And like the thing that just did it for me was like when the IG unit kills himself at the end and Queel dies in the last episode. Yeah. I'm like, that for me is absolutely artistic courage, which I really value. Yeah. Like, even like with Queel, like we want more of him, right? You leave us wanting. You don't bring every little. You could have him. Yeah. You could make like a Walking Dead BS thing where Queel's in it for like 7 seasons and he morphs into all these different characters. But like just like Shepherd Book in Firefly, motherfucker's got to die. Right? He's got to die early. Got to die unexpectedly. He has to be a motivation for us to go on.
This sort of world building of the Mandalorians themselves that we haven't fully gotten before. In some of like Clone Wars and stuff we know about Mandalore, but this aspect of it is new in this time period. And they sort of layered that throughout the episodes, right? We get a little bit in the first episode when he gets some armor built, and we kind of like slowly hear more and more about who they are and what his code is, and things like that. And I think I appreciate it playing off of, they call the original Star Wars like a space western, and this really leans into that.
Hell yeah!
And just goes with it. Yeah.
There's some things like, if I had to decide, and I know that I've talked about these few elements of the original Star Wars that like make it for me. One of which is like the weight of Han's blaster when he pulls it out of his holster when we first encounter him in Mos Eisley. And what that always conveyed to me as a kid is like, oh shit, like this is not a phaser. Yeah, like this is a serious made from metal. It's what conveys the realness of that world to me, is the weight of that. Yeah. Another one is like the degree to which Luke is in anguish when Darth Vader tells him he's his father. But I'll never join you. You know. Right. And also, the third is like in the Return of the Jedi when he is fighting Vader and the Emperor for the last time. It's like the sweat on his face. He is I mean, I'm sure he's make-upped, but like whatever Mark Hamill is doing at that point, like he whether it's makeup or whether it's like really stressed out or whatever, he physically is conveying authenticity. Yeah. And that has always rung out for me in those series. So in the Mandalorian, like I love that he's like the first thing that happens in almost every fight is he gets the shit kicked out of him.
Yeah.
And he gets smacked into a wall or blown up or shot or knocked to the ground. And like his armor is metal. Everything on his body seems to be real. That pulse rifle seems to be made of actual wood and metal. And you feel it. I mean, like it looks and feels like someone with some metal on, like being thrown into something.
Right.
And they keep that palette so well done, I think, with their stunt crew, that when he gets like blown up in the final episode and everyone's like, oh my God, are you okay? I would imagine the intensity of impact on the ground is actually higher than all the other ones, or at least that's the way that it's shown.
Right.
And that management of the physicality of it, like, just lends so much reality to it. And it's like, the thing that was always remarkable for me about the first Star Wars, when I watched it over and over again with my kids, is how short it is. Like, it moves rapidly through various things, and it doesn't spend all this time lingering. I mean, that was one of the things, like George Lucas, but in episode 1, I was like, all right, like, I'm waiting for the movie to start, and we're like, oh, the pod, and then we're done.
Yeah, right, yeah.
It's like we're Metachlorians already.
When does it start? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and The Mandalorian, it's a limited palette. It's 8 episodes, and it tells a really compelling story in there. And my point, which I am long-winded about, is because it's limited in that way, and Queel comes into our consciousness, comes back again, and then dies. The IG unit comes in, passes out, has that. I mean, like, all those scenes where he's training him differently, like, that's fantastic storytelling, right? Yeah. About him having a different function, about the function being the same as Queel's, about him earning,
that was really
it's just fantastic. Yeah. And then it's done. And we're not going to, like, what it looked like was that crew knew what kind of story they wanted to tell and how to tell it, and they just and they did it masterfully.
Yeah.
And they weren't worried about the franchise, and they weren't worried about what they're, and this is the thing, it's like they weren't worried about what they were going to write next. They just wrote this, right? And certainly there's like plenty of room for like all kinds of new badass like Mandalorian weaponry and all kinds of stuff in the future. They didn't limit what they were doing. But I think, because they had these characters come in and be taken care of and die, it forces them to do more creative things later, which I think probably from a business standpoint is risky, because you're, I mean, you could have 3 seasons of Queel, or you could have 3 seasons of that IG unit.
Right.
But it again, like The Last Jedi, felt to me like someone who was made by an artist. Yeah. Like the vast majority of Pixar films, as opposed to like other kids' films, they're made with an artistic vision, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I haven't heard fully what led him to it, but it does seem like Jon Favreau had that vision, whether they brought him in and he found that story, or if he pitched that to them and said, hey, I have this idea. But it definitely felt like he had a plan for how he wanted to tell it. And pretty brilliant, Baby Yoda bringing that element in and protecting it, I think it is pretty cool. A few sort of points about like structure. I think my experience, like the first episode, honestly was a little bit clunky for me. They kind of like had the sort of pilot thing where they're trying to set everything up, and some of the pace was a little bit off for me. The first humor scene with the alien didn't really work for me. It was a little too casual. I don't know if you remember the very first like bounty that he picks up, sort of the comedy and it didn't work totally for me. No. So I was like, I'm not sure how this is gonna go. And then that second episode, which is almost like a silent film, hardly any talking, like totally had me sold. And I'm not gonna pronounce his name, but Rick Famuyiwa directed that episode and one of the later ones. I think those were some of my favorite, and I think that episode just had like perfect pacing, had included great action. It had a lot of like him messing up and then figuring out in some more interesting way.
Well, and then I mean, like, and I think it's in the second episode with the Jawas, right? And like, there's something about, and this is how there's something about when they're like, he's like, and the blaster, and he's like, it's part of my religion. Yeah. And feels like, you're not going to get it if you don't do it. Right. Yeah. He's like, they seem upset. He's like, I did, disintegrate a number of them. Right. Yeah, and there's something about his like demeanor, which I find terribly interesting. Yeah. Because he's not a badass. You know what I mean? But in like it seems to be this like in this like this child who is taken by the Mandalorians and he owes them a debt and he's like stubbornly committed to doing the right thing.
Right.
Which is always my favorite kind of character.
Yeah. And I would say, as far as like the structure go, in the middle we kind of do get like a little bit of the filler, kind of standard episodes where he saves a village. And,
because Dave Filoni puts those in every show.
Yeah.
Seven Samurai is one of the greatest films ever made. You know, he just needs to make a Rashomon one. And, you know.
Yeah. And the other thing I realized is not looking at it in a fun way, but I do think Disney was hedging their bets a little bit and saying early on we decided, let's bring in some young, interesting directors for these films. And that did not go so well. With the Han Solo film, they fired the director. Colin Trevorrow was supposed to direct.
I'm glad Ron Howard took that over. What a great story.
And I don't think that's the popular opinion, but
really,
I agree with you. Most people think Solo movie, I think, is quite bad, and
really,
it failed for Disney, so lost money off of that.
Really?
Yep.
It's well made.
Yeah, I know. I prefer it maybe more than Rogue One, which is also not a popular opinion. But I was thinking, as a side note,
Hammerhead Corvette.
Yeah,
like that's some of the like going from action sequence to action sequence in like some.
I know, and I was thinking how. Again, I think I've said this on the show, but I didn't totally connect with the characters very much in Rogue One.
Yeah, they're all.
But like Han Solo might have some of the best character development.
Yeah.
Again, I didn't need to see a young Han Solo movie. No. I love the character of Han Solo.
I need a young Obi-Wan movie that's young Obi-Wan.
TV show is happening.
Really?
It's official, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Ewan McGregor said he knew for years, and he couldn't tell anybody because they wouldn't let him announce it. Yeah. So that's happening on Disney Plus.
We can stop now.
Yeah. Because, for instance, my wife and I recently debated, and we were talking to our son or something, and I said, Kira really, turns on Han at the end, though. She's kind of a jerk. And she was like, what? She's like, no, she saved him. She had to lie to him to protect him. And I was like, no, she became she was trying to become the new boss. And she was like, yeah, because she knew that they would both be hunted down if she didn't control that situation. So she sacrificed. And I was like, maybe you're right. So I was like, that kind of conversation about character we don't get in these new trilogy of films, right? Or at least the J.J. Abrams one. Yeah. So anyways, as a side note, but I do think Mandalorian, I do wonder if they brought in a lot of interesting directors for these episodes, including Bryce Dallas Howard, Taika Waititi, who I think now they're talking rumors that he's gonna get one of the main films, the feature film, Star Wars. So I think they were sort of testing the waters with some of these directors in a more safe environment of one TV show episode, and then see how they liked working with them, how they handled it, and they could be like, I think we can trust you with something bigger.
Yeah. And to that, I mean, it bears saying, it feels to me like in some sense, do you know Anne Lamott?
Yeah.
So I mean, I subscribe very much to her writing process, philosophy, which is the first thing you need to do is write a shitty first draft,
right?
And the act of writing is removing the barriers between you and your shitty first draft.
Yeah.
And so Rise of Skywalker is a shitty first draft. At best. You know, you're okay, the C-3PO stuff is good. I'm Poe and I want to run Spice. That's all right.
Yeah.
You know, Ouch is good. Ray from Nowhere is good. And then you move on and you do a second draft. And part of what, if I can make a global complaint around stuff is, this is a side note and it's indulgent. I remember one of my professors, he's Japanese American, and I studied kendo with him, but he was also a Buddhist philosophy professor for a long time. And one of the things that he would say, and this man named Mark who worked with him, was that in Japan, you teach for 20, 30 years, you retire, you write a book. in America, like academics have to publish all the time. You write lots of
Right.
books,
Yeah, yeah.
and so in some sense, you're publishing incomplete thoughts. Mm-hmm. And it's just my experience
You
of
just have
living
to
on this
publish,
planet
yeah.
for now 38 years or something. There's a bunch of stuff that I wrote about or talked about or wrote songs about or wrote movies
Mm-hmm.
about or whatever 10 years ago, and I'm like, that was the beginning of an idea which over years would develop.
Right.
And and I think it's clear in when someone writes their first novel, like when Susan Collins did The Hunger Games, like the first half of that book is just fabulous. You know,
Right.
those thoughts had been thought about for a decade or more.
Right, and then she's got to fill in
Right,
the end,
and
right?
yeah, but I just think that the Rise of Skywalker for me looks like, like a sketch along the way. I mean, it's one of those things like if I were at Disney and I would just hire Rian Johnson to remake it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, though, is like I think that part of what we're seeing is because I have a suspicion that like The Last Jedi will be a fluke. And that what Disney is going to do is much more along the lines with their management of Marvel, where they're going to be focused on a really middle of the road audience. And I don't mean to say, it's dumbed down and a little stupid.
That seems to be what's coming out. J.J. Abrams has started to talk about that he tried to fight for certain choices and wasn't allowed to make those choices. So, for example, Poe and Finn, they did want to make them a couple, and the actors wanted to do it. If you heard interviews beforehand, they would always joke about it. And Disney wouldn't let them do that. He didn't want the kiss at the end. He wanted there apparently was a different kind of ending shot, a different version, a little bit of it. And they also didn't allow him to have that cut. So I'm not saying like, oh, there's a different version that's better out there, but I think, and he's admitted, he had less time for this film than The Force Awakens, and I think no one would deny, at least what's there now is a much bigger film to make, at least than what he did for Force Awakens. And so that, I mean, I think unfortunately those things do play into it, and like you said, they probably just had to be like, hey, does this like make some kind of sense? Is it going to be a fun ride for an audience? All right, let's go with it. Let's go.
Yeah, and I guess like that's, and I mean, I'm loath to like point my finger at Kathleen Kennedy because she's responsible for a lot of good things.
Right.
But and I can blame faceless Disney bureaucrats.
Right.
But and I'm not. I don't want to sound like, this is ours. You can't do it with it what you want, because that isn't honestly my opinion. It's not so much that it's mine. It's just that it's like, it's like seeing like a cheesy TV version of the Odyssey or something. It's like, okay, like you did make it, and this is a telling in the grand scheme of these epic stories. But like, it's a pretty shitty one.
Yeah.
And like, it's ripe, for someone to tell a different version of the story. And the thing is, though, like, what it seems like I don't know how Disney necessarily works, but I think they probably have some way of managing the IP so that as long as they're getting so much money out of it, it works out in the end. And so they're allowed to do edgier stuff with The Mandalorian because it sells Disney Plus than they are with the movies. And it just feels like part of what plagued The Rise of Skywalker was just like the largesse, like the corpulence of the entire thing. That is wrapping up the trilogy, which like it doesn't have to.
No.
Like,
they talked about all this weight of like unanswered questions, and this has to be like resolved, and I was like, I don't feel like it needs to do that. Well,
I mean, and it's like as soon as the Return of the Jedi is done, like then all of us descend into creative play about what the F happens next.
Yeah.
I mean, and a whole. I mean, we were all born in this world of like the Jedi Academy, and this whole expanded universe of what's going on, like both the canon stuff and the stuff we made up on our own, like Shadows of the Empire. Yeah. And all these things, and it's a really, I don't know, it was a really creative space. And my point is that like it resolved one story, primarily the story of Luke. But like, what does Luke learn? Like, that's his dad. This is his sister.
Yeah.
That Han loves Leia. That C-3PO is cool. You know, like it's a really, in the end, a very tight story about a small group of people. And I know that like Lucas in the deluxe editions tried to expand that to give us a sense of the rest of the universe, which frankly I never needed. I mean, like all I like the thing that created, and so these are other two things, right? Like that I always remembered about like the original Star Wars, and one of them is like the age of the rebel fighters on the Corvette when Darth Vader comes through. Like, these are a ragtag bunch of bureaucrats and like idealistic academics who are not fighters,
right?
Who are like our dads, right? They are our father's age people there.
Right.
They're not brash young fighters. They're not soldiers. They're a rebellion. And the other one is, in Return of the Jedi, the way in which you have like the battle in Endor, the battle in space, the conflict with Luke, and you go back and forth with all of those things. It never reached the point of intensity where it was like about to explode, but there was like this collective relief in all those different things, which gave it its scope. And even just seeing like Mon Mothma and some of the other diverse array of generals were there, that conveyed for me enough of the rest of that world to tell that story. And like, so you want to show me Mon Calamari, that's cool, like, but I don't totally need it because I have a sense of the world that it exists in. And I always felt that like the celebration and whatnot that Lucas added was unnecessary.
Right. I mean, there's actually very few like locations in Return of the Jedi. Like, it's just like they spend a lot of time at Jabba's palace, which is kind of like actually these smaller moments. And then we're basically like with the Ewoks, and then like you said, we get the cross cutting with Luke and Darth Vader and the Emperor. But yeah, it's not a massive story that we're kind of trying to tell. Although I do kind of push back against some people who are complaining about like the pace of the new one. In some sense, you know, and they're like the opening is so like moves through things so quickly, and like even the opening crawl kind of like sums up things. But if we watch the original film, I mean, we jump right into Leia's ship being taken over, and we don't know what the heck, like,
we didn't know who she is.
Yeah, all these things happening.
She's part of a rebel alliance and a traitor.
So I actually kind of I thought the opening crawl of the Rise of Skywalker was actually pretty good. Like, it's kind of poetic and okay, and I am kind of a sucker for like, let's check out all these different worlds, which they kind of do. I don't think the reasoning why they visit all those worlds is very good in The Rise of the Skywalker. Yeah, so but I do enjoy that aspect of I want to go to these different places.
Like, there's like, look, if you just zoom out a little bit and look at it in a bit fuzzier sense. Yeah, like the moments on what's the planet where Poe goes back to get with Babu Frick, who's adorable.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Where you see Zora Bliss. He meets
that as like that's like kind of a restful, you know, in the franticness.
Slows down a little bit,
it's just all the stuff they're doing is stupid and pointless.
Right.
And it's like, and so it's like, why are you, so it's like, okay, Empire Strikes Back, okay? Right? What are they doing? They're saving Han. Yeah. What happens? Shit goes wrong, a leg gets stuck there, has to wear a metal bikini. Okay. Yeah. Right. Luke, Jedi Knight, comes and saves them. Okay. Everything happens for like every bit seems terribly legitimate. Yeah. Right. In this movie, like 3/4 of the movie is like people chasing around for some dumb thing with no real purpose.
Right. And this time the second time I saw it, I was thinking how Zora Bliss like switches on a dime to be like, pulls a gun on Poe and is like, you got debts and stuff coming back here. And then like instantly is like, all right, I'm on your team. I'm good. And like all they had to do, watch a second, she says something about like, oh, I can admit I like you, Rey, or something. Yeah. When she could have just said like, I've heard about you or something. Right. Like, and it would have given this element of like, oh, in the galaxy, this myth about
Yeah.
this new Jedi is going out, and that would have told us like, oh, actually, I can get behind what you guys are doing. And that would have played into the end, you know, of why all these people came.
And like to be kind to them, I bet if they would have spent enough time on it, they would have gotten there.
Right.
But I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
I mean, need we even mention The Hobbit?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
like, one of the things to contrast, I mean, I mention this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the things that I think should be a hallmark of all of these things is something like what Peter Jackson did with the OneRing.net.
Yeah.
To capture all that creative energy in the 90s.
Right.
And in just for like The Lord of the Rings in the 80s and some in the 70s too, of people just holding on to these ideas and creating art around them.
Right.
To harness that, to pick the best ideas to be part of your thing. And which doesn't make it, like, I also don't think fan fiction is pejorative, because I think Hamilton is fan fiction. That's part of what makes it genius, right? I do think, though, that, like, so, like, the what are they called? The Reylo shippers, who are, like, super into, like, the kind. I think that Kiss is just, like bait for the Reylo shippers, which is fine. I mean, Reylo shippers out there.
I didn't really have.
It's super sweet.
Yeah.
It was much more powerful for me the way he touched her and the way he healed her, and then having him die in her arms.
Yeah.
It's like you just saved the entire Jedi Order. Mm-hmm. And not to say this is bad or kissing is bad or anything.
Right.
It felt, again, it was a moment that it was like, I don't think this is something that Rey would do, because she doesn't really kiss people. Mm-hmm. And it's Star Wars. There's not a lot of kissing going on.
Yeah.
And it just sort of like, it pulled me out of the story in this really powerful moment to see the hand of the writer in there. And it was just like, come on.
Yeah.
And the only one of the few reasons why it was better the second time is, like, I couldn't be disappointed in the story because I knew it was going to happen. So I had an opportunity to find things that I liked more.
Mm-hmm. And I honestly don't really have. I've heard a lot of complaints about the very end where she goes back to Tatooine, and I don't really have too much of a problem with that. I mean, it's playing a lot into nostalgia that we all have, but it felt like a wrap up. And they did set up, you know, earlier in the film when they visit the planet with like the festival, and somebody asks her name, and she kind of says like, I don't know. So they do kind of set that up.
It's just, I just like don't. There was like a more sophisticated thing going on in The Last Jedi.
Yeah.
About, you know, but what Luke says, you know, like when a Jedi dies and the light is diminished, do you understand how arrogant that is? Like the fact that the Jedi don't own the Force. And this idea that, like, part of the reason why a tremendous evil exists is because a tremendous good exists as well. This parallel and duality, which, like, gets to the heart of one of my most interesting and beloved philosophical topics, which is like the existence of evil, like which is, you know, in, you know, following the work of you know, famous sociologist Norman O. Brown and one of his students Ernest Becker, like, we create evil so that we can vanquish it and become heroes. Like, that's why it exists. So it's very interesting for me to philosophically contemplate, like, what the relationship of the dark side and the light side of the Force are, because those are those things, you know. I mean, like Luke says, you know, like Yoda is, you know, the dark side more powerful, and he's like, no, you know, quicker.
Yeah.
And also, like, it touches on these perennial things.
Mm-hmm. So would you say you're excited about where Star Wars is going? Or are you apprehensive? Or how do you feel after this? What do you think Disney is doing? We do have The Mandalorian.
Well, I mean, not only do we have The Mandalorian, but we also have the concluding season 7 of Clone Wars, which I just watched the trailer of today, which hit on all of the big, great notes that I think made that show fantastic. I think The Mandalorian is great. It's some of the most exciting stuff that I've seen come out of them in a long time. I mean,
and by the way, a little tidbit for you: Deborah Chow, who is one of the other really fine directors, is going to be kind of heading up the Obi-Wan show.
Oh, that's great.
So they heard her. Yeah.
I mean, it seems as though, well, oh gosh, I mean, like, in an ideal world, although they would never admit it to other people, I would hope that Disney would look at, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
And recognize what they did wrong with the series. And then the next time they set out to make a series of films, whether it's a trilogy or something like that, they correct some of those problems. Now, I know that people will say, like, facts, right? Like, George Lucas didn't direct Empire Strikes Back, and some people say that it's one of the best. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that somehow Rian Johnson is the non-J.J. Abrams director.
Right.
But regardless of that, having watched, like 1 through 6 being done by Lucas and 7, 8, 9 not, there just seems to be some really clear boundaries that he doesn't cross with his filmmaking. And even if I don't love that trilogy, there's still a level of cohesion and story that is interesting and clever and may not be totally well executed, but everything reaches a certain standard.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't hold true in 7, 8, and 9, though there's cool stuff there. So my hope is that they'll learn from that. And there are like 8,000 of those like Marvel films, and I've seen almost all of them, admittedly, but I don't treat them in the same category as I do Star Wars. And one of the things that I think most exciting is I just finished watching season 4 of Rebels, which you have not yet watched.
Right. And
some of the stuff that happens in that season is some of my favorite. There's some of my favorite Star Wars moments in it. Like my probably, I don't know, I'd say like I said earlier, like totally top 3 Jedi showdown happens in this episode called Two Sons, which is just fantastic, quintessential, awesome blending of different generation Star Wars storytelling. And I think that it's like for everything you could say about George Lucas, he seemed to be able to maintain his coherency and standards when he was under a lot of pressure. Pressure he created when making episode 1 after having created Star Wars.
Yeah.
But looking at episode 1 and contrasting it with like Rise of Skywalker, like I may not love all of it, but it's not stupid.
Right.
It's not dumb. It doesn't look like it's been cobbled together with tape.
Right.
I think the how it should have ended, folks. I don't even know. I haven't actually looked to see what they've done with Rise of Skywalker, but it might also be just unfair. It's such a terrible. They might just be like or like the. Well, the one where the guy does like the different pitches. It almost seems like unfair. So the short answer to your question is that I'm excited about stuff, but it's mostly like the tertiary stuff. I'm excited about season 5 of Rebels when they make it for Ahsoka and Sabine to like travel off into the distance to try to find Ezra. I'm excited about season 7 of Clone Wars. I'm excited about Mandalorian, and I hope that somehow in their business model they can find a way to like turn the Star Wars from a mega blockbuster into just a good film and make a solid film.
Right.
Because I would hope that someone there, I don't know. I grew up watching the Disney Channel, and I had a deep appreciation for like Walt Disney and his vision of like creating environments for like really creative visual storytelling, vis-a-vis Fantasia and some of the other stuff that he had visions of.
Right.
And I would just hope that they get back to that a little bit. I think that's what attracted them to Pixar. And I would really love to see them, maybe it's, I don't know what they have to do structurally. Maybe it's scaling back,
right,
or maybe it's having such a diversity of different stories that you can be more adventurous with them. But they've built up a team of these directors and writers who have done a lot of stuff who are not J.J. Abrams, and that seem to take, like, Dave Filoni takes his responsibility as a custodian of the Star Wars storytelling seriously, and it's not just because we're fans of it and we like it, and I don't generally like the fan moniker. It's because it's an epic story that touches people all across the world and across time. And he seems to have, and a lot of others that work with him, that team seems to have a sense of how you handle stories of that caliber.
Yeah.
This is not something that you're going to read once and throw away.
Right.
This is something that is designed that if you follow the story, it gets richer every time you go through it.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, just thinking back to kind of the story I was talking about, I have been thinking lately, like, not making too big of a deal out of it, but this is sort of like the end of an era of like something we fans maybe never felt like would be complete, right? Would ever come out. And whether how well that all turned out or not. And I think it's a weird place for longtime fans to be at, to think, oh, and there's going to be even more, you know, when we didn't think there was going to be hardly anything, you know, at least on like on the screen, right? Maybe in books and video games and stuff, but not on the screen. These kinds of stories. And now we don't know when it's going to end, right? So it is kind of, I think for me, it's still kind of like a fun period because we didn't know we were going to get more of these. So I'm always kind of welcoming that. I've heard a kind of general sentiment of people kind of being like, yeah, I might be kind of done with focusing too much on it, like thinking too much about
that's cool.
What I'm
and
expecting
maybe
for
they
Star
can
Wars.
go back to playing Call of Duty or like Titanfall or whatever the fuck they do, and they can focus more on the rest of the people,
right?
Because I mean, again, like, I'm excited to talk to you after you watch season 4 of Rebels. There's a lot of storytelling that I've seen there, and we're rewatching Clone Wars from the beginning with the kids to get ready for the new season.
Too,
it's really good. And I've probably my third time through the Clone Wars. I just and I remember what I loved about it at first. It was finally there was just enough time to explore the rest of this world that sort of George Lucas had built.
Right.
And that's what makes it fun. And my hope is that the period that we're entering now is very much like the creative space that was created in Clone Wars, where there's space to tell different kinds of stories that are still like in this milieu, but can be limited only by some good imagination.
Right. And if anything, I think is Bob Iger, who's in charge of Disney, I think, has said that they admitted they sort of made the mistake of rushing these things out.
Yeah.
And they do want to give them a little more breathing space as far as like the feature films, to hopefully give them a little more time and focus on the stories that they do think they need to tell. And so that's a good thing. But I think these are like, the more I think about it and invest like time thinking and wanting to consume all this Star Wars related stuff, is like the modern myth that we've talked about before on the show, of these are the myths that we relate to and tell ourselves. And I think it is a good meld of sort of the past and the future, right? People have always kind of talked about that. It feels like an old world, but we do get things like blasters and laser swords, right? And I think maybe that is why we relate to it too much, of kind of bringing these two worlds, these two thoughts together, and seeing that in a fantasy version. But I think it is a cool myth that I'm willing to keep.
And I'll throw one last jab out there, which is that, like, one of the things that I always loved about the Return of the Jedi is, like, Luke does not succeed because he is tremendously powerful or a Jedi master, and Obi-Wan and Yoda prepare him for that. Like, it's not going to be like, you know, at best you train well so you don't get killed quickly, but that's not how you will succeed. I mean, he succeeds because he's able to convince one of the most evil men in the universe that he still has kindness. And like when Darth Vader does that, right? Like, it's a fantastic moment, right? And that is a perennial lesson. Like, that is as deep as any wisdom that you can find anywhere. And if you believe in one thing and it's just that, you are not poorly served in this human existence. And there just isn't an equivalent thing that happens to Rey. I really try very hard to rehabilitate what they do in that final scene, and I am at current unable to extract the same kind of perennial wisdom from it.
Yeah. I agree.
And we've talked. I can't even make sense of it. Like he says, you're going to strike me down, and then this ritual's going to do in this thing, and it's somehow like rewriting the little bit about Luke that there's some kind of ritual there. Like I didn't like that at all.
And then he says they're like a dyad, so actually I'm gonna suck both of your powers, and it's a special thing.
She kills him anyway, and I don't know. I mean,
although the passing of the lightsaber to Kylo.
Badass.
Through their connection is very cool.
And I felt like, I mean, you and I have talked about it before. I don't know if I've talked about it on the show, but that's how I felt. I was the exact feeling I had in like season 2 of The Leftovers. There were some like amazing moments of genius in there. And they spent all their time going to a flipping hotel and flipping around and like jumping around in a mud pit. Right? Like, tell me what it's like for her to get that phone call and think that it happened again. Right? That is the most interesting thing that happens. And I think in this, and we have, so like they're rewriting some force powers. You're passing stuff through space and you're healing people. Right? That's fine.
Which was interesting that they did line up.
With the Mandalorian.
With the Mandalorian like a week before to kind of set that up. And although, you know, they make things more messy with these force ghosts having lots of powers, being able to handle physical things. Luke pulls the ship out of the water, and I'm like, why aren't they helping otherwise? Where are they otherwise? I don't nitpick those things too much, but it's a story. But I think we're wrapping this up. This conversation. And we will have some great guests lined up to come to the show and tell some great stories and talk about movies coming up. And ideas. Thanks for listening.